Good afternoon. My name is Grant Toms, editor of Scots Independent, and we are here today in Srebrenica. And I'd like to introduce Nadina.
Hello. Hi.
Can you tell us a little bit? Sorry. Can you tell us a little bit about what the importance of today is in the lead up to the commemoration ceremony tomorrow?
So today we will be witnessing the participants from the Peace March coming into Potocari. In about 1 to 2 hours they should be arriving here. And this is a peace march that's recreating the death march that occurred in July in 1995. So about 6,500 to 7,000 participants will be going on foot from Nezuk back to Potocari, so doing the death march in reverse, and should be arriving here in Srebrenica to commemorate 31st anniversary of Srebrenica genocide relatively shortly.
And who would be the marchers? That's 6,000 people. Are some of them survivors from 1995?
A vast majority of them are actually either survivors or family of survivors. We also have groups of young people and volunteers and activists coming in. The number is increasing each year. There's more and more young people who are participating in this. It's quite an intense road. It lasts about 3 days with 2 overnight stops. And the more as the years pass, there's more and more people, young people, who are joining in, and there's also a lot of assumption. Most of the people who are actually participating in the march are either participants of the death march or they're close by families and friends.
And why would younger people become more involved in this as each year passes?
It's becoming sort of an activism thing in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a lot of people are involved in cultural activities, and they're also increasingly getting in touch with the genocide studies here in the country. I believe that the Memorial Center Srebrenica is organizing now a third summer school on genocide and genocide studies as well. And we have seen an increase of not just young people locally, but also young people from abroad who are coming into Bosnia and Herzegovina and coming into Srebrenica to commemorate in their own way the participants of the death march. I'm not sure about the exact numbers. As I mentioned earlier, much more young people are actually now taking part in this, and that's, as I mentioned, very honorable and very brave to see nowadays.
Yeah. Of course, today in the site, in July 95, the 8,382 men and boys were gathered for taken away for execution, is now a memorial site, and there's been a conference, students and young people learning about memorization and its importance in teaching history. What might be some of the lessons that we would expect a conference like that to focus on?
That's actually a very good question. We are focusing mainly on preservation of the memory and preservation of the culture nowadays. And one of the greatest issues is that despite these political decisions, such as the UN resolution on Srebrenica, on genocide in Srebrenica, that was adopted just 2 years ago, we don't really see the implementation and honoring of these political and legal commitments that we have. So this is mainly about teaching mainly young people, but also people who took interest in what happened in Srebrenica in 1995, to actually learn of how to transfer this information into permanent and genuine knowledge, and how to prevent it from happening again elsewhere in the world.
So today we expect most of the marchers to arrive. What will happen? Today we will expect most of the marchers to arrive. What happens tomorrow?
Tomorrow, according to the program of the Memorial Center, we can see at around 9 a.m., I believe, for the people to start gathering in front of the Commemoration Center and pay their respects to the 10 victims that will be buried here tomorrow, victims of Srebrenica genocide. And after that, we can see the religious program that will take place for a couple of hours for the religious communities that are here to pay their respects to the victims. And past that point, we will also see a bit more of the scientific program here at the Memorial Center. And that will be focused, as you've asked me earlier, on the culture of memory and commemorations, and including a gallery at around, I believe, 5 to 6 p.m.
And the centre that's based here on the site of the UNPROFOR, who were the peacekeeping force, it does more than just act as a museum for the massacre. It has a role to play in documenting what happened and ensuring that there's an archive, a record of this event. Can you tell us a bit about the centre itself and how it came to be funded, what it does in terms of how it operates?
So the Memorial Center here in Srebrenica actually came to be in early 2000s by the decision of the High Representative of Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time. And it started expanding. It was just incorporating this place for the burial. And then it acquired the previous industry here across the street, and including some parts of it where UNPROFOR soldiers were stationed as well. At around 2003, I believe, the center has started operating in the function that it does today. And with the support of foreign embassies and international communities, it became a museum we can actually see here today. So tomorrow at the Memorial Center Srebrenica, we can actually witness another conference and statements by the European officials who will be joining us today or tomorrow to pay their respects, along with the exhibition and the cultural part of the commemoration that I was mentioning earlier. And the Memorial Center itself is experiencing, it's not experiencing massive issues in terms of political governance and financing. However, it is relying on foreign support, and a lot of foreign international funding that keeps these research activities going on and keeps the memories of what has happened here in July 1995. They have activities across the year, so whole year round. As I mentioned, there is an international summer school that's happening here every 3 years now in a row around Srebrenica time. It's a week-long program that gathers international and local scientists to discuss genocide, to discuss its role or the consequences of it to a society and to political culture, and to explore the ways of how to prevent it from happening again.
Hugely important. You mentioned about the cemetery that's on the other side of the road where we're standing just now. It contains uniformly white marble commemorations of every victim of the massacre. It is a very large parkland that is quite heartbreaking to walk into and to recognise these were people who were massacred in a very short period of time. When was the cemetery laid out this way?
It was set out early 2000s as well. A couple of years after the genocide, nothing was really happening in the region. Mothers of Srebrenica and the families of the deceased and the missing were actually appealing to the both local and national and international governments to start with the identification of remains, to start with researching the mass graves. However, that wasn't happening until about 3 to 5 years after the genocide. And as I mentioned, by the decision of the High Representative at the time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, this place was set to be the cemetery for Srebrenica genocide victims. And to this point, I believe 6,000 of victims have been buried. Of course, the skeletons and their body remains are usually, most of the times, they're incomplete. Sometimes it's just a piece of one bone that they managed to identify through the DNA analysis. Nowadays, counting about 6,000 of people who are buried here in Srebrenica. And this year it's going to be about 10 more genocide that will be put to their final rest.
It's quite noticeable when you see the grave has been dug and the mound of earth to the side of it in a cemetery you think is now complete. But to know that there are still remains being found, can we maybe perhaps talk about why it's been so difficult to identify remains, about what happened to the men and boys when they were taken away to be executed?
So they were taken away to be executed on 11th of July 1995, and they were separated from their families. So all boys that were aged 15 and above were separated from the rest of their friends and families. And during the massacre and during the burial, they were buried at multiple different mass graves. So this was done by the Army of Rebublika Srpska at the time to actually more challenge and complicate this identification part of the victims years later. The issue that the local population here is always mentioning is that a lot of people who live their daily lives in the surrounding of Srebrenica actually do have some sort of information of where these people who are still missing, where they're actually located, where are the mass graves being located. However, it requires a lot of cooperation between two different ethnicities, two different governments. People are also staying silent out of their own, sometimes even fear for their own lives, because the situation is obviously very sensitive, and the governance, the political regimes in Bosnia and the administration, the way it's set, it's reinforcing these divisions and reinforcing the complicated nature of the country itself. So they were separated, the bodies were separated to actually make the identification more difficult. So now we have, I'm not sure about the exact number, that's very few, if at all, of the, actually there is a couple, not that many, but of the complete bodies that we have found. It's usually partial skeletons, and every year we're finding more mass graves and more victims who were actually buried there.
Yeah, so horrific, not just in terms of dealing with knowing that your father or brother or son went missing, but that the remains were never kept complete. And we have seen through other genocides when there have been mass graves uncovered after the Second World War, and at least there the bodies would be intact and whole. But here we have a situation where the Serb Republic Army and the people that supported them actually tried to disguise and make it really difficult by this horrible emasculation of people in order to hide the fact of who they were. There's very little in history of that ever happening before, and I do wonder if that's one of the big things that we're going to learn through history of the attempts that people had of trying to disguise their victims.
It was a part of broader regime and broader governance system at that point. And if you go to the museum here at the Memorial Center in Srebrenica, you can see in one of the exhibitions a letter that was made by the mothers of Srebrenica, discussing the fact that none of the local governments, none of the national governments, agencies of national governments or international community, international organizations at around the year 2000 have actually dedicated themselves and committed to identifying of the remains and looking into these mass graves and looking into the missing people's list. Currently, according to that same exhibition here, the Red Cross that was operational at the time would, upon the request for information for a missing person that's from Srebrenica, they would simply take out the name out of the missing people's list, out of the deceased list, and transfer them to the missing people's list. And that was overly complicating the situation because the people who were being asked about are now being declared that they're not deceased or not missing. And there's a lot of issues with the governments. It's not only the malicious intent, it cannot be reduced to this point, but there is also the nation building that worked in a way that it did in the early 2000s, and lack of commitment also from the international community at the time that complicated the situation on the ground. However, now every year, for better or for worse, we're actually identifying less and less amount of victims. We have identified vast majority of people who were massacred here in Srebrenica. However, as I mentioned earlier, there is still a lot of remains to actually be found, because some of these burials were made on simply one bone. And we are still uncovering mass graves, mass remains from many different locations. Some people who are victims of the genocide have been found on multiple locations across the region. So we can expect this year it's about 10. The number is reducing as the situation gets, the numbers of victims that we're yet to identify obviously reduces. Also, we are not familiar with all the mass graves that are present here in the region, but we can actually see the increasing commitment by the local government and by the international community as well to resolve the situation to their best knowledge and their best possibilities and capabilities at this point.
You talked earlier about the mothers of Srebrenica. Can you tell us a bit about who they were and what they did and their role in trying to find out what happened to the victims?
Mothers of Srebrenica is, name says, they're the mothers of the victims here, of the boys and men above the age of 15 that were killed during the genocide. And they were, I would say, one of the largest driving forces, especially in the early 2000s when the mass graves were just starting to be uncovered, and when we managed to identify the first victims and to bury the first victims here in Srebrenica, in Potocari. Their role is very multi-factored. It's not just the civil society organization that's basically pushing this, pushing the political actors, pushing the local governments to actually commit to identifying remaining victims, but they became in Bosnian society a sign of resilience and of resistance. We always say there is no worse situation than burying your own child and not knowing what happened to them and not being able to know. And they became the sign of Bosnian resilience during the time through all these situations that emerged. As I mentioned, they were actually the driving force in the early 2000s. They were looking for answers for the members of their own family. And that's how the society came to be and how they actually started their political work and how they managed to accomplish so many different things here for Srebrenica.
Yeah. And it's been known that civil society organizations such as that, with a huge personal involvement in this work to seek justice for their families, that they're not just unwelcome by the communities who were on the other side, so to speak, but sometimes they can be seen as getting in the way of their own governments, almost like, your family has gone, let's just stop trying to find them and let's move on. Yes. Has that been the case for the mothers here, or have they had total support from the government authorities?
It really does depend. It depends on the time period. It depends on the level of governance. A lot of times, especially in the early 2000s, a couple of years after the war, they were left to fend for themselves. They didn't receive any sort of support from local government or for the international community. They were trying to uncover this truth themselves because they experienced and they didn't enjoy any sort of political support at that point. However, nowadays it's really dependent, as I said, on the levels of governance, on the time periods, on everything else. They became, now their role is, I wouldn't really say accomplished, because they were, as I said, the driving force after the war, they were the driving force to start with the identification. They're still asking for answers every day, but their role is much bigger than that. It's much more, it's both symbolic, it's much more important than what it actually is being represented in the media. And they've adopted a bit of a different commitment to this issue. They've now started to advocate for for memory preservance, for preservance of Bosnian identity and for the identity of genocide survivors, now that the process of victim identification has been ongoing. So, but yes, they have their own challenges as well. They're still experiencing the challenges. The support from local authorities is usually a bit more limited than it should be, but they're moving forward, and these women have incredible strength, especially after such horrible things that have happened to them and their families just 30 years ago.
Thank you. We're going to take a break. Come back in 5 minutes. There'll be continuing pictures of the march as they arrive. But that's it just now for Broadcasting Scotland. We'll be with you with more commentary to follow. Hello, it's Grant Toms, editor of Scots Independent, and I'm joined with Nadina Hodgic. We are here with Broadcasting Scotland to cover the March to Srebrenica. And as you can hear from the background, we have different types of people coming to show their support. What must be about 100 quad bikes and their drivers and partners. And a huge motorcade of motorcyclists are just arriving. Naturally, they make a lot of noise, so we're going to move into the background so that we can carry on commentating, and you can see all the different quad bikes and bikes arriving as part of their march to Srebrenica. Let's go over, Nadina.
Of course.
Well, it's gone a little bit quieter now. There are many more people lining the side of the street that is actually shaded by trees. And as the shadow of the trees stretches over to the other side of the road, people are moving into new positions. Do we expect many people more to be arriving to watch the marchers arrive?
Oh yes, absolutely. Every year there is about at least a couple of hundred, if not up to 1,000 of people lining down this street expecting for the peace march to come. What we see right now is actually a part of this commemoration of the peace march. Actually, we have about, as you said, rightfully about a couple of hundreds of quadders coming in today, including a marathon from Bihać, including some participants that are here with us every year from Vukovar, from Croatia. We have also seen bikers coming in about an hour ago, and they're still coming in. So a lot more people as part of this peace march commemoration part of it. We'll also see a lot more attendees and the participants lining up the street. This part is still it's not in the shade, it's still in the sun, so vast majority of them are on the other side of the road. But since the marchers will start to arrive in about 45 minutes to an hour and a half, I think we will see this part on the right filling up and much more people coming in as the time approaches.
Now, one of the interesting things is in the lead up to today, we have been touring Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we met a group of marchers in Tuzla who were wearing red t-shirts remembering Srebrenica, and we've seen in Sarajevo itself different coloured t-shirts, white, green, of groups of people who are doing the march. What do the different colours of the t-shirts mean?
Well, they don't have general meaning. They usually represent the geographical regions where the people are actually coming in from. Generally from Bosnia, as more of a neutral ones are the white shirts with the number 8,372, the number of victims of the Srebrenica genocide. We can see a bunch of bikers coming in their black shirts. These are the participants from Turkey usually, who take part every year as well in the peace march and in the commemoration of Srebrenica genocide. So it's mainly dependent on the region, but it has, as I said, it has a geographical significance. That's how the participants of the peace march actually sometimes differentiate amongst each other as well. And it also depends on the organization they're coming from. A lot of companies, a lot of different public agencies, civil sector are also allowing their employees to come in and to actually take part in the march. They usually have some degree of paid leave or ability to be off work for a couple of days because of Srebrenica genocide. So they sometimes can represent also the organization they're coming from, whether it is private sector or public sector or international participants, as we can see right now. So yes, a lot of different factors, a lot of different details that actually make this, let's say, difference, but yet somehow unity among the participants.
Yeah. And you mentioned that some of the bikers here in particular would be from Turkey. People might wonder at home, why Turkey? What's the connection of Turkey to Bosnia?
Turkey and Bosnia have rather decent bilateral relations. Turkey was one of the countries that actually supported, I think, the main partner and the main donator in the renovation and the establishment of the memorial center here in Srebrenica, in the museum that we visited today. And both Muslim majority nations, the governments themselves and the authorities themselves are in quite good relations, and Turkey has been supporting activities in Srebrenica for the past 25 to 30 years. And there we can always, each year we can see a number of Turkish participants in the Peace March and in the commemoration itself. A lot of journalists as well coming in from different international agencies, from different agencies in Turkey, in the Middle East, who are actually from Turkey as Turkish residents to take part in the commemoration of Srebrenica genocide.
And is that Turkish connection to Bosnia and Herzegovina also related to its past role as a colonizer during the Ottoman Empire days, which actually brought, I believe, Islam to this particular geographical area?
Yes, Ottoman Kingdom has been in governance of the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina for about 500 years. They were in this territory in the Balkans. They've also, upon the arrival of the Ottoman government, they have detained and killed the last Bosnian king at the time, I believe in 13th or 14th century. And it's a very complicated relationship. Now, they did bring Islam to Bosnia with certain benefits to the political participation, for instance, higher levels of political participation, political power, exception for taxation in the country, which also prompted a lot of people who were non-Muslims in the region to actually accept Islam at the point. And yes, Bosnia did in a way become more Muslim country upon the arrival of the Ottomans, and they have cherished that connection from the time they were also a bit more understanding, and they had a little bit of, I wouldn't really call them privileges, but more, let's say, milder policies towards non-Muslim government here. Of course, they still were, as you mentioned, colonizers of the region, and this is one of the huge parts of the genocide and the war in Bosnia as well, because Bosnian Muslims who were victims of the genocide here in Srebrenica were often declared as Turks by the Army of Rebublika Srpska. And this, not just the genocide itself, but the war in general here in the region, was seen as the revenge against the Ottomans and the fall of Kosovo earlier in Serbia. And this is something that Serbia as a country today still has very sensitive feelings, has very delicate, it's a very delicate issue in general. And so yes, Turkish influence is very high. As I said, especially here in Srebrenica, in this area, they have made sure and invested a lot of time and effort and money into renovations of the memorial center here and the cemetery across the street as a sort of way to commemorate the victims and as a way to reinforce the bilateral relations that they have with Bosnia in general.
So many people might not be aware of the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in that not only did the Ottomans colonize, but this part of the world was also subject to rule under the Austro-Hungarian Empire from the 1878 onwards, and then following after World War War, the fall of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, we had a period of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, where Bosnians were a minority within that kingdom, and then following World War II, we had the communist regime of Tito and allies towards Moscow. So this, probably since the fall of communism, we've actually now seen more clearly Bosnia and Herzegovina as a truly independent state. Have any of those other colonizers been blamed for their, the harm they've done to this country in the way that some things were projected onto Bosnians, not rightly, but as part of this complicated history, there seems to be a very selective view about taking revenge, if that's the right word to use.
It is a very interesting question and very interesting phenomenon because, as mentioned, Bosnia is a country that's very deeply divided religiously, ethnically, many different nationalities living here outside of constituent peoples as well, and had a very complicated history. It has its geographical presence is of huge geopolitical significance. It's an entry to, it's an entry and both an entry and an exit of the European Union. It's not really, it's not, I wouldn't exactly say bordering, but yes, effectively bordering Middle East and North Africa region, which became very prominent also during the migration crisis in 2015. So its relations with the colonizers are very complex even today. So it genuinely depends on who is being asked. So how will they perceive the certain country and their role in shaping of Bosnia and Herzegovina as it is today. The way it objectively stands is that each of these colonizing countries, as much as Bosnia is maybe suffering certain degree of consequences from that colonial period, also brought something that's uniquely theirs and something uniquely different. For the Austrian-Hungarians, now with the Hungarian relations, close relations with Serbia, the perception among Bosnians in general, Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Muslims is a bit lower than it used to be before, despite the fact that they still cherish this commitment between two countries as the Eastern European states. And the Austria, allegedly there was, I don't know if it's still active and it's still being implemented, but there was a contract between the two countries that was 100 years long for student exchanges, scientific research, and etc. And this is something that, due to Austria's geographical proximity as well, a lot of refugees from Bosnia during the war have immigrated to Austria as well. A lot of Bosnian immigrants, economic immigrants, and the refugees from the war are now living in Vienna, in Graz, and etc. So it really depends on the group in the country and how is that being perceived. During the Austro-Hungarian governance at first, that was the first instance of Bosnian language to actually disappear in certain point of history, was during this period. And this is obviously a very sensitive issue to discuss, given the fact that also on the other side, Austria-Hungary has invested a lot of monetary support, a lot of funding for the region. First trams in Sarajevo, I believe, were also developed and put in place during the Austro-Hungarian period, and of course what ensured the First World War that started in Sarajevo. And so there is a lot of different nuances and very different details to this that are kind of shaping the perception of the countries who once ruled over this Bosnian territory up until its independence in 1992.
It's very clear from visiting many of the towns in Bosnia and Herzegovina that the architectural influence of Austro-Hungary is very clear in that kind of late 19th century feel to some buildings, not to all. And it creates a very rich tapestry of different influences on how towns, communities and cities grow and develop. From something that looks like 19th century architecture, something that looks much older in terms of the mosques and their 15th, 16th century architecture perhaps, and then the kind of brutalism of what we call the Soviet era, which, the utilitarian housing, which was so important for people after the war, frankly, and it lives cheek by jowl. There's no one area that is so uniquely different to the next. Every part of it has a little bit of something from the different stages of the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Would you agree with that, or is there something I'm missing?
Oh yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I was actually talking about just now. It's yes, of course there are always the colonialism itself is a very negative thing, but there are certain benefits that Bosnia did have from each of these periods, and I think what also tourists and international workers who are here, what they found very interesting in the country is exactly that architecture that you just mentioned. You can actually actively see these influences of all the different periods. What I would prefer to be done is for the local governments to actually take better care of the external levels of the facilities, to put them in protection as much as possible, and to prevent these this architecture, these buildings, to prevent them from falling apart and from deteriorating through the time. However, what you also interestingly pointed out, you can see this mix of, let's say, the Stari Grad in Sarajevo that has much more Ottoman influence, and then past certain line, there is an inscription that says where east meets the west, and on the other side you can see on the western part of it a bit more Austrian-Hungarian influence. And the more you walk through the city, then you can start seeing the Soviet Union communist brutalism, the buildings, the utility buildings for the workers. And it's all it left some of the really beautiful things that can be witnessed today. So when you walk through some of the larger cities in Bosnia, like Sarajevo, Banja Luka, Mostar, as well, you can see how the history actually shaped the country, and that's very unique and very interesting to see in that extent on such a relatively small space for all these different cultures that are overlapping.
And to bring it back to here, the other aspect about particularly Sarajevo, where we've been based, is how much buildings were damaged, shelled, set on fire by the attacking Serb armies, and to the point where you can walk around and see the shell potholes in some of the buildings to this day. So as much as we've got the rich architectural heritage of different eras, we have this effect of the last 35 years of the war impacting on the physical environment in which you grew up. How much does that affect the psyche of people living in various communities?
It's, I believe, much more difficult for the people who lived under the siege of Sarajevo. It's a strong reminder of what happened in very recent history, just about 30 years ago. Sarajevo siege, as you mentioned, is it's the longest siege in modern military history. And these reminders, as much as maybe among younger activists who have been occasionally arguing that, again, it is maybe a task of the local government to preserve the infrastructure and the architecture of the country, it's also a very strong reminder of what the country looked like not even 3 decades ago. And this is, especially for newer generations and especially for tourists and for newcomers who are coming to Bosnia who want to learn more about the history, this is a very powerful reminder, something that remains ingrained into one person's memory rather than reading about these things from the history books. And this is something that they can witness everywhere across the city, and not just in Sarajevo, but across different cities in the region, in the country. As you said, the shelling of the buildings, you can actually see in Sarajevo, for an example, where you're based, how certain buildings were actually on the line that were being shelled by the Serbian military at that point. And they were all usually called, they have like local jargon names, they're usually called protector buildings or something to that extent, where you can actually see the damage that's been done to them. And as I said, it's a very powerful reminder of what happened, what's the one, unfortunately, but one of the biggest parts of history of the country, of the modern history. And it all ties up to what has actually happened here in Srebrenica as well, and how are people managing to live their everyday lives with this memory. For younger people, somebody who hasn't lived through the war as much as I did not, for instance, it's a reminder of what can happen, what's a possibility at all times, maybe unlikely possibility, but nevertheless, it's not just about the buildings or about the siege, it's most importantly about human lives that were lost during the war, lives of the civilians who were involuntary forced participants to this, who didn't want to take part into it. And but it also, as I said, serves as a lecture for future generations to find different ways to cooperate and to resolve and to um, cherish and to reinforce this inter-ethnic, inter-religious contact, and to make sure this doesn't happen again in the country, and that everything else for any other concerns to be resolved in as peaceful manner as possible through any of the channels, especially now with what's happening, for instance, in Ukraine, after we have said so many times that we're not going to let it happen again, to serve as a reminder of what actually happens when there is lack of, when this difficult situation arises on the ground, but there is also a lack of commitment from international organizations, from international actors, that this needs to be a cooperative effort, that there needs to be open dialogue with the countries. And so yes, but I think that people who actually lived through it are suffering the most, let's say, the biggest consequences from these reminders that are on a daily basis. It was interesting also during COVID, for instance. I was living in Sarajevo at the time and speaking with local population. People were grabbing some of the canned foods. It was very difficult to get by either food or water or anything else, and except in Sarajevo, which, okay, it was limited surely, but a lot of people have said that they will not participate into it because of the memories of the war and the way they remembered how they were gathering and collecting all sorts of canned goods and flour and paper and water, and what memories it brings to them. So they have made their peace with whatever it is that happened, but they don't want to go through it again, even if it's at their own expense. And I think vast majority of the people still live with such a memory, especially since it's a very fresh one and unresolved, so to say.
I did read a panel in the museum about how during the night, some of the people in Srebrenica would do night raids to neighbouring villages that had been evacuated to try and find food and get back again before dawn light had arisen, because there was no real place to be able to grow or to find food in Srebrenica during its own siege. I can't imagine what it must have been like to, under the cover of darkness, trying to get through enemy lines in order to get some food to be able to survive. And yet that happened here 32 years ago. Astonishing, to say the least.
Yes, in Srebrenica in particular, because the humanitarian assistance was very limited, especially at the time. Even in early 92, by 93, certain parts of the humanitarian help, humanitarian aid was about to get successfully into the town, and there was a certain degree of hope among the local population. But past that point, once the local borders closed down again, it was starvation. It was very difficult for the local population to get by and to actually survive on what they had because of this inconsistent either shelling or moving. A lot of people who came to Srebrenica who were victims of the genocide are actually from local villages around Srebrenica themselves, who were pushed out of their homes and gathered here in the city. So yes, it was very difficult period, definitely something that we witness also today across the globe. And the way they worked was basically, yes, they would go into raids of their either Serb neighbors or other population that was more stagnant or located more permanently in one location, and they would be raiding, either stealing cows for the meat, stealing chickens, then digging out some vegetables and trying to collect together berries and stuff like that. So also the help that was coming in, and there is one monument, in case you haven't seen it in Sarajevo already, of the Ikar can that was delivered. Yes, it's the can and next to National Museum.
The Eternal Flame?
No, actually, no. There is a monument to a can, like a canned good, next to National Museum, and it says underneath there is an inscription that goes to the international community from forever grateful citizens of Sarajevo. And those cans were actually cans of pork meat that local Muslim population did not they couldn't really eat them according to their religious instructions, and they were more often than not remnants from Vietnam War, so those cans were expired years ago. And they solved nothing, absolutely. People were trying to, who lived in urban areas, who lived in apartments and in flats, they were having chickens or cows or sheep live on the balconies, and they were sold for extremely high amounts of money just so they can purchase some other less expensive things like flour, like water, like bread or things like that. So it was a very difficult situation. Here also at the Memorial Center you can see some of the images on the walls from local population in Srebrenica who are gathered in the next to the UNPROFOR's stationary, next to their base, and going through the garbage, trying to find some leftovers of the food so they can actually feed themselves until some sort of humanitarian aid actually comes into the city.
Yeah, and the site in which the UN peacekeeping force had was a former was it a chemical factory owned by an organisation called Planum. Oh, we've got some of our first marchers coming into view now.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about who these might be?
Yes, so the marchers are supposed to be arriving at 6:15. Now we have members, I believe this is the Red Cross of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think these are from different locations in the country. I think some of them might be foreigners as well who came here to commemorate Srebrenica genocide. We can see them walking along this one line. I think now we will increasingly see people coming in from different organizations, different agencies who are participants to the march, and a little bit earlier than expected, but we can see them most likely in the next, let's say, 2 hours, about 2 hours, they will be walking by.
It's certainly a very busy day with many different people coming in at different times. Almost, as we would say in Scotland, a gathering of the clans. Different groups of people, families of people, people whose community might be where they worked or where they lived, but coming together at different times to commemorate where we are. Now, one of the things I was about to start talking about before the Red Cross appeared is that the UN peacekeeping force occupied the Planum industrial plant, a series of industrial buildings, and this became the kind of military post for the peacekeeping side of it. It has now been converted, bought from that private company and converted into a site of memoriam. Much the same way as we've seen the Holocaust Memorial Trust in Germany and Poland preserve Auschwitz, Srebrenica, to help educate newer generations as to what went on there 100 years ago, or nearly 100 years ago. And yet the lessons in Europe still have not been learnt, where we have similar massacres, genocides taking place. Do we think that people, and particularly young people, should be brought to a site like this in order to learn about what happened in our lifetime or my lifetime, in order to try and again educate to prevent it ever happening again?
Absolutely, yes. I've mentioned before that the Memorial Center here in Srebrenica has recently started to organize summer schools that are targeting either students or young researchers. This is third year that this program is being organized, and I think it's very important to bring people in, not just young people who are from this region, but internationally as well. I think, as you rightfully mentioned, we are now witnessing more massacres, more genocide across the world. you often cannot really help but wonder, did we learn anything from any of them, and what can be done for this to be stopped, especially because genocide as a such act does not start with the killings. It starts with the humanization of the victims. It starts with propaganda. It starts with all these different steps that were so clearly outlined in the international legal sector, that in order for such act from being, let's say, a massacre to be classified as a genocide. And it has these very specific and strict instructions, so to say, very strict stages that were very obvious. So one cannot help but wonder, actually, why are we not intervening when these beginner stages start? Because genocide as a genocide is a massive act. It's not something that happens overnight, and the consequences of it are absolutely so horrific that I think it warrants, and it can actually make early intervention more reasonable and more plausible when we're talking about acts like this one. So I think it starts, as you rightfully pointed out, it starts with education. It starts with student exchanges, research exchanges. It starts with being actively in touch, and as uncomfortable and as sad and horrified it makes us feel when we visit places like these, I think it's very important in order for us to be able to react and intervene and recognize these signs once they start happening again. And it's obviously, as given the current state of political affairs, not that it can be actively predicted, but it can be assumed where or when or how certain massacres can actually start happening. So I think this should absolutely, the education should absolutely serve as a reminder for all of us to intervene and to find mechanisms to actually resolve the situation, to respond to the humanitarian needs of local population, to rescue the local population before something like this happens again.
And earlier today there was an educational conference in the centre, and the opening remarks included the Dutch ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina, who many think of being the UN peacekeeping force at the time in July 1995, when they opened the gates to the refugees from Bosnian Muslim refugees. Were basically taken away by the Serb army, and certainly organised into killing groups. And I did wonder if there is some kind of sense of regret, guilt, that they perhaps couldn't do more, and that perhaps even at this late stage there's still the opportunity to help, and to particularly through funding activities in order to learn from the situation.
Yes, absolutely. It actually left a huge mark on the UNPROFOR's Dutch bat that was here present in Srebrenica. So what actually happened is that the research has shown that a significant number of people who were participating, who were part of the Dutch bat here during the Srebrenica genocide, have either committed suicide or have experienced severe mental health issues. That number can go, depending on the research, it goes anywhere between 10% to 25 to 30% of the soldiers. I think vast majority, up to 95, actually experienced severe PTSD. And when you look into the situation objectively, it's a very understanding for local population in particular to be not just grieving what happened, but to feel a certain way of that the justice has not been served, or that the political effort and the political commitment during this time was insignificant to the proportion of the events that were happening on the ground, actually. So, but and that's very understandable given the scope of the events. On the other hand, what Dutch bad soldiers have repeatedly, some of them have mentioned, is that they felt forced into basically not doing anything, because they were, as peacekeepers, as their mandate is, they're not supposed to intervene in the conflict. They are very lightly, if at all, equipped with weapons. They are not supposed to. The only method or the only time when they can have some degree of interference is in self-defense. So if their life is at the risk. Otherwise, they're supposed to be observant of the situation. They're supposed to, it's expected falsely, of course, that their presence itself will actually do the part of the peacekeeping, large part of the peacekeeping, which obviously each year is being proven to be incorrect. So their stories and their accounts are also very valid because they had no means to actually intervene and to defend themselves. They were promised by the commander, I believe, of the Dutch BAT and by the Dutch authorities that the help will arrive in terms of airstrikes in the morning of the 11th, that they will receive humanitarian aid, that they will receive, they were calling for aerial action at that point. They were also asking for any sort of heavy armament that they might carry, but this was all for the aerial strikes. They were promised to happen in the morning of the 11th of July. For everything else, they were told that because keepers, they're not supposed to be involved. So their involvement and capacity to actually do something was severely limited at the time. And I think that affected their mental well-being in the aftermath of the war extensively, despite the fact there are also images that people, local population or international courts as well, do bring up often, and those are pictures of the Dutch BAT soldiers having a drink with soldiers and the commanders of the Army of Rebublika Srpska as an reminder of their alleged close alliance. But as I said, also has to be understood that these people who had no means of defending themselves, let alone anybody else, could actually react any differently in that sort of situation. So yes, the research has shown that they do suffer severe mental health consequences. There are a couple of Dutch BAT soldiers who, I believe, either before, I'm not sure 100% if they're still here, who live here in Srebrenica surrounding area, who've been, they've mentioned that they've been robbed a couple of times or having some issues with the local population, but they're not to that extent, not too much. But they said that they're very aware of what happened and what their role in that part is, and that any reaction that they have to saying that they're part of the Dutch BAT is very warranted and justified. So you can see even today that Dutch BAT soldiers or soldiers from other UNPROFOR forces that were in Bosnia and Herzegovina are looking for members of local population who they were close with. Just recently, one soldier from Sweden who was stationed here, I think in eastern Bosnia, managed to find his friend from the war. And I think that impacted the war itself, and the massacre, especially here, impacted everybody on all sides very severely. And as I said, this has been behind us. We can actually see the place where Dutch BAT soldiers were stationed during fall of Srebrenica. And it's a very significant place of visit for participants of the commemoration and participants of the Peace March as well.
I think you've rightly touched on something that is very confusing to ordinary members of the public. If we hear the term UN peacekeeping force, we assume that they have the agency to intervene in order to ensure peace is maintained. And to hear that actually, no, that's not how they, and that's not what they told the local community of what their role is, what their powers are, but then to talk about an airstrike the next day. So it's very confusing as to what then UN forces, peacekeeping forces, what their role is if they can attack people with airstrikes, but they can't be armed personally when they're on the ground, boots on the ground. Maybe that's something that just really helps show how much the United Nations really is not understood what its institutions, including things like peacekeeping, how they actually are carried out, what their role is.
So there are three different methods to this for the UN itself. It's peacekeeping that happens during the war, peacemaking and peace building that happens after the war. And something that you rightfully pointed out is not very often understood is that peacekeeping forces are not military intervention. They're effectively civilians, not civilians, and they are military personnel. But their role is not to have intervene in this sort of way. They have very limited mandate, very limited capacities, where a lot of things are the situations are counting to be resolved by their presence on the ground, by not use of arms, and etc. So when it comes to airstrikes, obviously foreign governments can and have the capacity to get involved in any point of time, and this happens outside of the United Nations framework. It's the same thing with NATO intervention in the 99 with Kosovo, absolutely, yes. So peacekeeping as part of the UN is completely different game. It's a completely different method, and I think personally that it's very justified that it evokes certain degree of negative perspectives, and where people are actually questioning what their actual role is and what can they do, given that they are risking their lives by being in the area. So yes, it's very confusing in general how to classify this sort of intervention, and can countries actually intervene, and to what capacity. Unfortunately, the United Nations, as the largest global organization, has been on the receiving end of these negative perspectives since the Bosnian War, because that was the, I believe, first instance for the UN, for the peacekeeping forces themselves to actually get involved in a war that's at that big of a scale, and to test what UN was made for in mid-20th century after the Second World War, to facilitate this dialogue and to have a conflict resolution and conflict intervention that's successful and operational. So that was a test, and unfortunately it ended very unsuccessfully. And to this day, this organization in the country is subject to the same perspectives that they were during the war itself. It's the nature of it. It's not a fault of the UN itself. It's the nature of bureaucracy and nature of administration when you have such a large organization with very limited funding, with very massive bureaucratic apparatus. It's bound to fail at certain points. It's just a matter, and what I think is very important is identifying these areas where intervention can be facilitated in cases like in Srebrenica, for instance, and if that can be even done through the UN, and if not, then what's the way of keeping the peace, and can it be done more effectively?
So, interestingly, one of the differences in the Bosnian War compared to other conflicts nearby later, and we've touched on Kosovo, is that NATO intervened in Kosovo but didn't intervene in the Bosnian War. Can you comment on why you think NATO didn't feel the need to engage at this time?
Well, the situation started with the fallout of Yugoslavia in Slovenia with a 10-day war, and then it moved on to Croatia, because Croatia was asking for independence as well, and war in Croatia has already started. And Bosnia followed the same path when referendum was being held, and what the international community thought at that point was, because they were delaying recognition of Croatia, that if they do so as soon as possible for Bosnia and Herzegovina, that massacres would not happen on the territory. So they did the political part of it and the political effort. However, that didn't stop any of the killings. It didn't really change the course of action for former Yugoslavia, so today Serbia. And that was a major problem in their approach, because the US, as a biggest NATO member, was being led by Bill Clinton at the time, who was still on the fence whether he wants to intervene or not, because of what was very famously said. What was very famously said was that about their intervention, and that is that they don't have a dog in the fight, and that was often repeated by the American diplomats at the point. So the approach to Bosnia was very different. They were still counting on the power of non-intervention, and that situation would be resolved without actually getting involved.
So, slight pause there as we see our first group of marchers arriving for the evening gathering. The march is in silence. Is this normal every year?
Yes, absolutely. People are observant of the marchers in relative silence. They're not being formally greeted. They're marching through and get this point over here, the end point in Potocari. This is the second group we're seeing. There are also a group of Red Cross members, I believe. Yes, we can expect more of them coming in the next 5 to 10 minutes, where other members who are parts of the official peace march who will be coming in, yes, very, very soon. We are now seeing that these both parts have rather lined up, and I believe I can see the part of marchers and the Bosnian Republic flags coming in from the bottom of the street. So they will be here in next 2 minutes. They will start to come in.
Yes, we can see the stewards starting to spread out along the crowded area on the east side of this road, trying to make sure that people get back into place. And much as everybody wants to stretch out and take photographs, that can get in the way of the people and their solemn march here to Potocari. We expect something in the region of 6,000 plus people to march here today. And can you tell us a bit about where they might be coming from?
They were coming from all the different parts of the country. It's organized peace march, so applications are open a couple of months before the peace march takes place. They're coming from all the different parts of Bosnia. They're coming internationally from different countries in the region, from countries across Europe. There are also a lot of people who are taking part are members of Bosnian diaspora as well. So we're expecting at very least 6,000 people. Some reports are saying 6,500 to 7,000 people. That's the approximate number of the applicants who are coming in. And this is I believe, one of the biggest marches that we had in the last few years here in Srebrenica.
That's going to put a lot of pressure on accommodation in a relatively small town tonight. How is the community going to cope with thousands of people staying overnight ahead of the commemoration ceremony tomorrow?
Well, regarding accommodation, it's been booked out already, so everybody's relying on local population and staying with friends and family who lives here in Srebrenica and who came or returned after the war to the region. And I said a lot of them are locals as well and are staying in nearby cities. And yes, it's a place and there's a lot of logistics and a lot of preparations.
And this first flag that we see coming into view here with the fleur-de-lis, 6 of them on a blue shield with a white stripe, whose flag is that?
That's the flag of Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's the flag that Bosnia was added to United Nations to order that very flag. It's also a very similar flag to the army.
And we are back. We have just seen the end of the march commemorating Srebrenica massacre. Thousands of men, women, and young people took part in it. Nadina, what's your thoughts on what we've just witnessed?
Yes, so certainly this peace march is much larger than the usual ones. A lot of members of the international community as well, a lot of young people. We could see a lot of schools and a lot of civil society organizations that took part in an organized manner this year. Yes, as it's wrapping up now, we can see the final participants of the march being on quads and the bikes and the cyclists also being a part of it. And they're going to pay their respects to the victims of the Srebrenica genocide. Some of them are already returning back. And the official commemoration is going to start tomorrow at 9 a.m. when peace marchers along with other residents and participants in the commemoration of the Srebrenica genocide will come here again to Potočari to actually pay respects to the victims and to be part of the religious as well activities that are following the commemoration and to make sure this does not happen again somewhere else. So yes, we're wrapping up at the moment. Very final participants are coming forward, and the commemoration is going to continue tomorrow.
Okay. So we'll come back tomorrow to witness the commemoration. It's been a very solemn march, is why we weren't commentating through the march itself. People observing, witnessing the marchers in utter silence as a mark of respect, and we joined them in that. So join us tomorrow on Broadcasting Scotland as we report on the commemoration ceremony itself.